Alright guys, how's it going? It's been some time since I've talked much about Nvidia. 10 months ago, in fact, when they launched their Turing Super Series refresh just ahead of AMD's Navi. Nvidia's cards were still on the old 12nm node at TSMC, while AMD had already been half a year on TSMC's 7nm node with Vega 20. Navi came on the 7nm node too, and Nvidia could have been in a tight spot. However, I think it's safe to say that the 5700 XT and 5700 were mid-range cards, just beating the 2070 and 2060 non-super, while consuming a little bit more power. It's also fair to say that I wasn't really impressed by this at all. However, I noted that Navi 10's small die size of only 251 square millimeters meant that AMD were very competitive on area, which was mostly thanks to the more advanced 7nm node. And in fact, in order to beat the 5700 XT, Nvidia had to refresh the 2070 to the 2070 Super using a larger die previously reserved for the 2080 class GPU. TU104 is a mammoth 545 square millimeters, more than twice the size of Navi 10. The 2070 non-super was based on TU106, and that was still a large 445 square millimeters. But with the Super being so much larger, that means it is a lot less manufacturable. And we can see this in a die per wafer calculator, that even with a slightly better defect density, the larger 545 square millimeter die size means that you only get 83 good dies on a wafer, compared to this Navi 10 die, which even though it has slightly worse defect density rate due to 7nm being newer, AMD still gets around 190 good dies on a single 7nm wafer. That's almost 2.5 times more good dies on one single wafer. However, in terms of overall cost, there wouldn't have been a great deal between them, because these 12nm wafers are probably less than half the cost of the 7nm ones. But it's important to understand a couple of things here. The first thing was, as I said, AMD's performance per watt with Navi was still bad. Only matching 12nm performance and power with 7nm is really bad. And the second thing to note is that Nvidia can always pull levers. They always have larger chips that they can use and they will use, regardless of cost, just to stay ahead. And so with that in mind, I declared that whenever Nvidia gets to 7nm, Navi would get crushed. And that was a pretty safe comment, to be honest, but as it turned out, Nvidia made a real meal of getting on to 7nm. We'd actually began to hear rumours in late 2018, early 2019 that Nvidia had signed up with Samsung's 7nm, not TSMC's. When I first heard the rumour, I thought, this is just typical Nvidia trying to get lower prices out of TSMC. But it won't work. I never actually believed that they had intended to go with Samsung though. But in fact, just the week before they had launched the Super refresh, their Korean chief, Yoo Young-yoon, Korean not being my native language, said that its production of advanced GPUs will be conducted by Samsung Electronics with its 7nm EUV process. And while Yoo did not reveal the exact amount of foundry production by Samsung, he acknowledged that production would be substantial. Just in August though, the very next month, rumours of Samsung's 7nm node being in trouble surfaced over at DigiTimes, with a claim of under 30% yield rate. Samsung moved quickly to rubbish the report, but that's par for the course. There was even an insinuation that TSMC had seeded false information to DigiTimes. But then, in September, they reported that lead times for 7nm production had increased to nearly 6 months from the previous 2 months. A sure sign that more business was heading TSMC's way. And by the tail end of the year, Nvidia had changed their 7nm tune entirely, with their CEO, Jensen Huang, stating at the Chinese GTC that the vast majority of next generation 7nm orders will be handed over to TSMC, while emphasising that it isn't difficult to make 7nm chips, but the company's goal is to make the product have the highest competitiveness and value, not the most advanced. That's a pretty interesting comment when you think about it. And Nvidia clearly believed that their lead against AMD was so large that they could get away with a new series on older nodes, just like Turing was. And just as I had, Huang had written off the Radeon Technologies Group ability to come back with a truly competitive architecture. I can't remember which video exactly, but it was either just before or after the turn of this year when I finally wrote off the Radeon Technologies Group completely. To my surprise though, I received an email soon afterwards titled Big Navi, and the email simply said, "Looking good for this part. Very good. Do not think flop yet." Now, ignore the poor writing style, as a lot of my sources do this to protect their identities further, and this source has been very good multiple times. So that was early January, and to say I was very and pleasantly surprised at reading this would have been an understatement. And it was only a few days later when a mystery, new AMD engineering sample GPU/CPU appeared on the OpenVR GPU benchmark leaderboard, beating out the best 2080 Ti result by 17.3%. And this essentially put this card at around 29% faster than an average 2080 Ti. There was speculation that this was the G14, which was recently launched by ASUS, but clearly, the GTX 2060, which is inside that laptop, cannot get anywhere near this kind of performance. So this is either an error in the benchmark, or it is a legit card. We simply don't know. And previous to that benchmark leak, we had just uncovered some chat on Big Navi from a Taiwanese BBS, and that had the following alleged specs. It was TSMC 7nm with a very large 505 square millimeter die, GDDR6 memory, and twice as fast as Navi 10. Though there was some confusion over whether or not that should be twice as large as Navi 10, as obviously 505 square millimeters basically is double 251. And my January source got back to me saying, reports about the parts back are 100% true. I asked for clarification on what parts they meant exactly, but they didn't elaborate. And then in February, a different source told me, several people inside Nvidia are worried about Big Navi's performance, and because of this, they have decided to pull in the Ampere Titan. March came next and gave us a good reason to believe it with the reveal of the Xbox Series X APU. Digital Foundry got the scoop, and the whole system on chip was much smaller than anyone believed it would be. Only 360 square millimeters, and that's for 8 Zen 2 cores, 56 RDNA 2 compute units, of which 52 are working and the other 4 are being used for redundancy, and a whole bunch of SRAM cache. What is more about the GPU? It was locked at 1825 MHz. And I'd long theorised that the Xbox Series X GPU should perform similarly to a 2080 Super. And Digital Foundry noted that they were shown benchmark results that, on this 2-week-old, unoptimised port of Gears of War 5, the Series X was already delivering very, very similar performance to an RTX 2080. 2 days later, and Sony's Mark Cerny revealed that the PlayStation 5 APU would also contain 8 Zen 2 cores, but this time only 36 GPU compute units, well down on Microsoft's 52. However, these were now running at an eye-opening 2.23 GHz boost. Do note, however, these claims that Mark made during the presentation.
Running a GPU at 2 GHz was looking like an unreachable target with the old fixed frequency strategy. With this new paradigm, we're able to run way over that. In fact, we have to cap the GPU frequency at 2.23 GHz so that we can guarantee that the on-chip logic operates properly.
2 GHz was looking like an unreachable target with the old fixed frequency strategy. But with the boost, we have to cap the GPU frequency at 2.23 GHz so we can guarantee the on-chip logic operates properly. So if we combine what we know about the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5 GPUs, it really tells us a lot about what to expect from RDNA 2. The only thing that we are missing is the knowledge of how much power each of their GPUs is using. The problem with that is, lacking that particular knowledge prevents us from knowing if RDNA 2 is amazing or if it's just good. There are a few ways to analyse this though. Microsoft clearly believed that 1825 MHz is a very safe frequency, and the fact that the PlayStation 5 boosts to over 2.2 GHz is simply more proof of that. Furthermore, Sony will probably sell over 100 million PlayStation 5s, and they all need to boost to 2.23 GHz. That just means that 2.23 GHz boost must be an extremely reachable target for this silicon. And Microsoft almost certainly could have used a boost too, but they felt it wasn't really needed as they already had an unassailable lead due to their much larger graphics portion, 52 compute units compared to 36. But what did Cerny mean by 2 GHz fixed looking like an unreachable target? Well, during that part of the video, he also talked about how the console would have to remain cool and quiet for years, and that games later in the generation cycle could end up drawing quite a bit more power than earlier titles. The best way to analyse that is, Microsoft played it very conservatively on clock speeds, knowing that 1825 MHz fixed will last 7 years with ease. Sony, they can give a 2.23 GHz boost now, and they can say that most titles right now, i.e. the early launch titles, should run at close to that mark. And Mark did say that, in fact. However, as it's a boost, they also leave themselves with room to manoeuvre later on, when the graphical complexity rises, and maybe 2 GHz by that point might not be possible. If you think about ray tracing and the effect that could have on power and clock speeds as the devs wring more performance out of the consoles, there is a likely reason why. And remember, both consoles are in a constrained power environment, which needs to be cool and quiet for years on end, and the CPU cores could be loaded at the same time as the graphics. And in fact, over time, as the devs get more used to multi-threading Zen 2 and making use of SMT, that would be exactly what we expect to see. A fully loaded 16-thread Zen 2 core at 3.6 GHz or so is gonna draw around 30 to 40 watts of power on top of the GPU portion. For that reason, it just doesn't seem likely that the GPU portion of either chip will consume more than 200 watts. However, do note that Sony have implemented AMD's Smart Shift technology, which allows the GPU to draw more power while the CPU is drawing less. It may well be that the PS5 GPU consumes more power than the Series X does, at least early on, as the GPU is able to maintain 2.2 GHz for longer. And while that might seem unbelievable looking at the specs on paper, power does not scale linearly with clock speed and the extra voltage required to maintain those higher clock speeds. According to AnandTech, the Xbox One X drew 172 watts at load while playing an enhanced title, Gears of War 4. So that's 172 watts with fully loaded CPU and GPU. Both of these upcoming consoles will draw at least this amount, and probably more. Over 200 watts each? Yes, easily. March actually told us quite a lot about the next generation consoles, but also quite a bit about where RDNA 2 stood. Then in the middle of April came yet another leak, this time not only mentioning the 505 square millimeter Navi 21, but now also Navi 22 at 340 square millimeters and Navi 23 at 240 square millimeters. And this came from the same leaker as the Taiwanese BBS, who it is claimed may be a TSMC employee. As Matthew noted in the article, we're now starting to get a clearer picture about what exactly to expect with Navi 2X. And so let's pull all of this information together and see what the analysis tells us. First of all, let's have a look at RDNA 1 compared to Turing. Over at Computer Base, they pitted an RX 5700 against an RTX 2070. There was a good reason for doing that, as both cards have an identical configuration of cores and memory. All they had to do now was lock both of the GPUs at 1.5 GHz and run the benchmarks. And surprisingly, the 5700 came ahead by a very small margin. And I say surprisingly because over at Tech Power Up, their 2070 Super was 12% ahead of the 5700 XT. And if you check Tech Power Up's clock speeds and power limit page, we find that the clock speeds of each card are actually pretty similar on average over the 20 or so games that are benchmarked. Computer Base though did note that there are massive differences in some games, which likely means in this case that RDNA 1 is getting a benefit that doesn't really exist in a lot of titles. And with the absence of more testing on this level, it's probably prudent to go somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to do that and assume that Turing has an IPC lead of 6% over RDNA 1. So next I decided to make a table of most of the recent mid-range to high-end graphics cards, starting with Nvidia's RTX series. We've got the card, we've got the chip codename, how many compute units it has, Or in Nvidia's case, of course, that would be streaming multi-processors. And you simply multiply this by 64 to get the number of cores. The clock speeds of each card I took from Tech Power Up, who are extremely thorough in testing all aspects of a graphics card review. And all of these numbers came from the aforementioned temperatures and clock profiles page that we saw. And this was actually an important step, and I'll explain why later. Over at Tech Power Up's 2080 Ti Founders Edition review, their card averaged 1824 MHz, whereas over at AnandTech, their 2080 Ti only averaged 1745 MHz. But for consistency purposes, I'm going to stick with Tech Power Up's numbers. Multiplying the number of cores by the clock speed, and then multiplying by 2 before dividing by 1 million gives us our teraflops figure. Again, all of these will be higher than Nvidia's official numbers, because the official numbers are based on extremely conservative boost clocks, while the average card, or at least the average review card, boosts a fair bit higher than that. And finally, by multiplying the teraflops number by the IPC, we get a theoretical performance number. And like I said, Turing 6% ahead of RDNA 1, which I have used as the baseline of 1. So in this case, Turing gets multiplied by 1.06 for a theoretical performance of 16.83. And what's interesting with this theoretical performance is it rarely scales 1-to-1 with more cores or compute units, or at least in the case of RTX. So for example, the 2080 Ti should be, theoretically, 36% faster than the 2080 Super, but it's not. According to Tech Power Up's 2080 Super Founders Edition review, the 2080 Ti is only 16% faster, and all these numbers, of course, I always take at 1440p. It's much better comparing the 2080 Super to the RTX 2080 though, where a theoretical performance difference of 4.4% was shown as 6.3% over at Tech Power Up. And for the RTX 2080 against the RTX 2070, a theoretical difference of 31% ends up at 20.5%. So it's safe to say that I wasn't entirely satisfied with that. However, it clearly shows that there is no one-to-one scaling with an increase in compute units. So next up, I decided to check with the Pascal generation of cards. For IPC, again, I used Computerbase, who compared a 5700 XT to a GTX 1080. Same number of cores. Unfortunately, the 5700 XT does have slightly faster memory. However, downclocking both to 1.5 GHz, and I gave a little bit of benefit to the Pascal card, and decided that if Navi was a baseline of 1 IPC, Pascal is probably 0.89. And this is where researching this stuff can get annoying, as Tech Power Up, who are a very large site, for some reason didn't get a Titan XP from Nvidia. So I've got to use their Titan X Pascal numbers and modify them slightly. And according to my theoretical performance numbers, the Titan XP Pascal should be around 42% faster than the 1080. And again, using the modified figures of 110%, that would put it 39% ahead of the 1080, which is much more satisfying than what we saw with RTX. Regarding the GTX 1080, it should be 94% ahead of the GTX 1060, which seems an awful lot to me at first glance. And in fact, using the same table, we could see that the GTX 1080 was 68% faster. And so last for Nvidia was the Maxwell generation of cards. As we know, Maxwell and Pascal basically had identical IPC, but Pascal had much faster clock speeds. The Titan X should be around about 40% faster than the GTX 980, again based on their theoretical performance, and in fact it turned out 30% faster. Using the same review, GTX 980 and GTX 960 2GB numbers, the 980 should have been twice as fast, and in fact it ended up 83% faster. So that's not too bad. And putting all that together, I think that if we learn something from all of this, it's that teraflops calculations are not fantastic in showing how graphics cards, within the same generation at least, line up. In fact, if anything, it shows us how more compute units do not scale particularly well with extra performance. And this is very likely to do with shader occupancy. It's a lot harder to keep 68 compute units filled with work than it is 36, for example. And a second consideration would be memory bandwidth, as say, this RTX 2070, it is much less likely to be memory bottlenecked than a 2080 Ti. if you compare the respective number of cores and the memory bandwidth. Remember, the 2080 Ti only has a 384-bit bus, so around 50% higher bandwidth. That's with 89% more compute units. Where this does get interesting though, is comparing generation to generation, especially Maxwell to Pascal. If, for example, we put the Titan X Maxwell up against the GTX 1080, we see something that, while at first glance would appear to be incredibly unlikely, actually happened. 1080 should have been 31% faster, based on this theoretical performance and teraflops. And indeed, it was 31.6% faster, according to Tech PowerUp. And if you compare the enormous differences in die sizes, remember the Titan X Maxwell was 601 square millimeters, whereas the GTX 1080's GP104 was only 314 square millimeters. It seems unfathomable that the latter could be so much faster. But that is a difference that a new node makes, and more importantly, this is a difference of higher clock speeds. Even though the Titan had 20% more cores, the 1080 had an enormous 58% higher clock speed. What does that tell us? With the same IPC, faster clock speeds seem to scale much better than number of cores when it comes to final performance. Now moving on to AMD, and it's a little bit more difficult due to RDNA 1 only having the 2 chips in the series. We've got Navi 10 and Navi 14, with the 5700 XT, 5700 and the 5500 XT respectively. This is quite an interesting matchup though, and the 5700 XT should be around 21% faster than the non-XT. But in fact it was 12.5% faster. So the 5700 non-XT should have been 53% faster than the 5500 XT, and it was actually pretty close there at 60%. But the really interesting thing about these cards is, the 5700 XT, based on this theoretical performance compared to the 5500 XT, should have been 85% faster, and it was 80% faster overall. That's also 80% faster with 82% more cores. So what we're seeing here with RDNA 1, at least at the low and the mid range, is that performance seems to scale very closely with the number of compute units. Clock speeds are pretty similar between these two cards, and yet Navi 10 appears to scale almost linearly with extra cores. And that's not really what we saw with Nvidia's cards. And so with the current generation done, what about RDNA 2? It goes without saying that what you're going to hear next is a mixture of speculation, leaks, estimations, and best guesswork. However, it should be at least grounded near to reality if it simply follows these patterns which you've just seen. I am, however, highly depending on much of the unknown information being legit, like for example, these other leaked die sizes of 340 and 240 square millimeters. But before I get to these, let's take a look at a much more known quantity in the game consoles. The Xbox Series X, we now know, is a 52 compute unit GPU running at a fixed 1825 MHz, which gives us a 12.15 teraflops GPU. These numbers come directly from Microsoft. And so based on the simple teraflops calculation, it should perform very, very closely to a 2080 Super, if it were just RDNA 1. According to Tech PowerUp, the 2080 Super outperforms the 5700 XT by 26.5%, while the teraflops theory would be 31%, so that is pretty close. And we've just seen how RDNA 1 scales pretty linearly with cores, at least between 22 and 40. But like I said, that's based on RDNA 1. I had a leaker tell me some time ago that IPC was up with RDNA 2, as the last remnants of GCN were swept away. However, I wasn't given any figures. It could be 5%, it could be 10%, it could be 20%. I just don't know. What I've done is go with what I believe is a safe-ish figure of 10%. So if RDNA 1 is a baseline of 1, RDNA 2 would be 1.1, so very slightly ahead of Turing. And I really don't think that's an awful lot to ask. And this would give the Xbox Series X a theoretical performance rating of 13.36. And like I said, it probably scales a little bit better than Turing does with more compute units. And so with that in mind, I believe that the Xbox Series X will come in around the middle of the 2080 Super and the 2080 Ti performance, but possibly just a little closer to the 2080 Super. The PlayStation 5 We have 36 compute units at an amazing 2.23 GHz. So that's 10.28 teraflops and 11.3 theoretical performance. And that should allow it to perform very closely to an RTX 2080. And again, apart from this IPC, all of these are known quantities, so there should be nothing really controversial about what I'm saying here. And incidentally, this is not a slow RTX 2080, clocked at 1900 MHz on the Tech Power Up review. Right, so moving on to RDNA 2 on the desktop, Navi 2X, and we'll start with the lowest end. 240 square millimeters for Navi 23, going by this leak, which looks pretty solid. This really ought to just be an RDNA 2 upgrade on Navi 10, the 5700 XT, which as we know has a 251 square millimeter die. So we expect the same number of compute units, obviously the same number of cores, but a much higher clock speed, and hopefully higher IPC. How much higher clocks? I mean, for me, 2.23 GHz on the PlayStation 5, that is an extremely safe target, you have to say. Is there any reason why we should not be assuming at least 2.2 GHz? I can't think of any. In fact, I believe that number is lightly conservative, so I decided to increase it to 2.3 GHz. Remember, this is a graphics card, which we should expect to scale at least to 225 watts, because that's what Navi 10 does. Even though it's quite a small chip, it scales all the way to 225 watts of power. There's no reason why the 6700 XT would not do the same. So 11.78 teraflops would put it just slightly above 2080 super performance. A theoretical performance of 12.95 versus 12.38. And this 6700 XT, it really ought to be an entry-level price card. 6700 XT should beat the 2080 Super, or at least be very, very close to it. Now again, this is speculation, but what does your analysis tell you? It's very similar to Navi 10's die size, it's very likely to have the same configuration as Navi 10, and there is absolutely no obvious reason why it wouldn't hit at least 2.3 GHz. Again, the only thing up in the air is the IPC, but these teraflops numbers are close enough that they really ought to perform identically, or close enough that it makes no difference. And remember, AMD did claim 50% better performance per watt during their financial analyst day back in March. Do note, however, that this was an internal estimate, so keep that in mind. This is very likely to be a comparison of Navi 10 versus Navi 23, below the 200 watt mark. We know that the 5700 XT has a game clock of up to 1755 MHz. However, having a look around the reviews, the cards seem to hover around the 1850 MHz mark, and that was the figure that I went with on the chart. And just comparing the teraflops numbers of 11.78 and 9.47 tells us that Navi 23 should be around 24% faster. If we just compare the teraflops numbers of 11.78 for Navi 21 and 9.47 for Navi 10, that tells us that Navi 23 really should be around 24% faster in compute, and therefore around about that percent faster overall. This actually works out quite nicely from earlier 7nm slides, when we knew that this 50% extra performance per watt that AMD talked about, that also generally equates to around 25% extra clock speed, which would be at the same power. Either take 50% better performance per watt, or 25% extra clock speed at the same power. 1850 MHz, and then just simply add 25% to that, gives us almost identically 2.3 GHz. As AMD said, same power, same configuration. So we should expect the 6700 XT to scale similarly to the 5700 XT and be around 20 to 25% faster. That's simply what the analysis says. Right, so next up, Navi 22. And here is for me where this got really interesting. What you're looking at here though is an annotated die shot of Navi 10. This is by Sashley Cat. I talked about this previously, but the pink part here, all the way down the left, is most of the fixed function stuff, the I/O, and this should remain similar in most of the chips. So this same pink part stays largely the same, regardless of whether or not it's the 505 square millimeter big Navi, the 340 square millimeter mid Navi, or the 240 square millimeter small Navi 23. And this green command processor also likely stays the same size, or it grows just a little bit in the case of the larger chips. I compared all these elements in Paint, and I concluded that the command processor was 7.67 square millimeters. And this I/O part was around about 40 square millimeters. And we know that the entire die is 251 square millimeters, and so the rest of the stuff, these memory buses along either side, and then all these red shaders, and the ROPs and L2, all of the rest of this stuff must come in around about 200 square millimeters. So that means for every 20 compute units, and its associated 128-bit GDDR6, that's both sides, the area required for all of this must be very close to 100 square millimeters. And so we've now got this list of Navi 2X dies, 505, 340 and 240 square millimeters. And we've got a fair idea of how much area 20 compute units takes. And of course there's a chance that 20 RDNA 2 compute units use more or less space than RDNA 1, but we can analyse that as well. And I suppose the obvious place to start would be with Navi 23, the 240 square millimeter chip. And as I just said, given Navi 10 was 40 compute units and 251 square millimeters, the smart money would be on Navi 23 being an identical configuration, just a tiny bit smaller, which is either due to the process shrinking marginally, or they've just somehow managed to squeeze this down a little bit compared to RDNA 1. So if we project all of that onto the supposed leaked die sizes that we got, for Navi 22, 60 compute units should be the assumption here. If the Xbox Series X can squeeze 52 compute units and a 320-bit bus into that 360 square millimeter APU, including the SRAM and 8 Zen 2 cores, then I am fairly sure AMD can squeeze 60 compute units and a 384-bit bus into 300 square millimeters, with the other 40 being the I/O. And if we look at the clock speeds, even just going back to Turing, we don't see a massive difference in clock speeds depending on the numbers of compute units. 2070 had 1850 MHz, the 2080 Ti 1824, with the mid-range ones around the 1900 mark. That's not a huge deal of difference. And so for the 6800 XT, I've just went with 2200 MHz, so 100 MHz down on the 6700 XT. And that gives us a crazy 16.9 teraflops mid-range GPU and a theoretical performance rating of 18.59. It was at this point that I remembered the OpenVR benchmark and the claim that this unknown GPU was 29% faster than the average 2080 Ti. And this made me really excited because the first time I did this table, I had simply used the official teraflops figures for the 2080 Ti, which are in fact only 13.4, and that would have given a theoretical performance of 14.2. And if you compare that 18.59 to 14.2, you get 30%. However, as we saw, the average 2080 Ti is almost certainly running quite a bit faster than Nvidia's official documentation claims. Almost always going to be higher than 13.4 and likely closer to 15. It could just be possible for the 6800 XT to be that much faster than the 2080 Ti, but I don't think so. If it's not faster than the 2080 Ti though, it'll be extremely disappointing. Depending on what AMD feels they need to achieve, they could easily hit 300 watts with this card. If the 5700 XT does 225, and the 6700 XT should scale that far as well, there is zero reason why a 6800 XT with a slightly larger die size would not scale all the way to 300 watts. And with that, it should easily be able to maintain 2.2 GHz and clear the 2080 Ti by a decent distance. Just stick a decent bloody cooler on it, AMD. And with that, we'll move on, at last, to Big Navi, Navi 21. The first thing to say here is, I didn't really like how this has a die size of 505 square millimeters, while the other two are 340 and 240 square millimeters respectively. As I've shown, the expectation would be 20 compute units and a 128-bit memory bus for every 100 square millimeters of the chip. And I do believe that Navi 21 will have a 512-bit memory bus. First of all, because there is clearly room for it in 505 square millimeters. And second, because ray tracing really benefits from having the extra bandwidth. On the other hand, such a large DPU will also benefit from having redundancy built in. So it may in fact be a 96 compute unit chip. However, only 80 are getting used. That would make sense, and it would also line up nicely with the die size. What you're looking at here would be an 80 compute unit chip with a 512-bit memory bus. and this should be 440 square millimeters. So we go 240, 340, 440. That still leaves 65 square millimeters, which would just about fit another 16 of these compute units perfectly. Remember, it is only the compute units that are getting added, because the memory bus has already been paid for in this previous 100 square millimeters. And so I will start by assuming 80 compute units for the 6900 XT and 5120 cores. This time I've decided to drop the clock speed by a fair distance down to 2050 MHz, which is well down on my assumed 2300 for the lower end part. So I believe I'm being slightly conservative here, but the clock speeds will need to be down just to keep power under control. And that gives us 21 teraflops and a theoretical performance rating of 23.09, which in theory would make it around 37% faster than the 2080 Ti, based on these two numbers. The only benchmark that we have to go on, this OpenVR benchmark from January, suggested an AMD Radeon Engineering Sample GPU, which was 29% faster than the average 2080 Ti. These numbers are close enough that they likely make a little bit more sense than what would have been a fantastic result if the 6800 XT could just have been that much faster instead. And so, with AMD done, let's get back to Nvidia. They really made a meal of getting on 7 nanometers. And Retired Engineer pointed this out in another translated article on Twitter, which suggested that Nvidia did indeed gamble and tried to get TSMC to drop the prices. Number 5, as the cost for advanced nodes began skyrocketing, there have been rumours that Nvidia and others frequently leaked news about their intention to increase Samsung's share of the orders in order to pressure TSMC into lowering prices. However, as we all know, thanks to TSMC's absolute leadership position and demand exceeding supply, they did not budge. And whoever at Nvidia came to this decision should be fired, because literally anyone could have told you that TSMC's 7nm would sell every wafer, probably 3 times over, had they had enough capacity. There was also some speculation that Nvidia may be using the higher cost but better yielding 7nm EUV process. But that is actually the opposite from what I was led to believe. EUV should have slightly worse yields but lower cost. However, so I'm not entirely convinced by this argument. But Nvidia did finally, with the launch of A100, get onto TSMC's 7nm. What was weird about this is they specifically mentioned N7, which is the older 7nm process. And that might not mean a whole lot. It could just have been a mistype. But my information was that N7 is now 7nm plus, but it no longer means 7nm EUV. Confused? Me too. This whole thing is a mess now. Names don't really matter as much as the numbers do though. And Nvidia's mammoth A100 die, 826 square millimeters, stole the headlines a couple of weeks ago. But it's fair to say that not everyone was impressed. And it's not difficult to see why. Because we only got a small increase in FP32, 35% more shaders, and a reduction in clock speed against V and P100, which are the previous 2 generations on the older node. Now this certainly opened my eyes, as did the increase in TDP. But to be fair, Nvidia has slapped a whole lot more onto this large die, including a massive increase in memory bandwidth and a whole extra bunch of tensor operations. But yeah, no, this doesn't look great in compute, to be honest. And due to my long-held belief and many others that Samsung would be fabbing Nvidia's gaming GPUs on their 7nm, and then when that ran into trouble, the rumour was that they would go Samsung 8nm instead. And then when you combine that with RDNA 2's seemingly stellar performance, I was under the assumption that this A100 would need to be cut down for Nvidia's Titan. Nvidia would cede the card to the larger tech press, Big Navi would be resoundingly beaten where it matters most to Nvidia. In performance, if not in performance per dollar. Nvidia will never lose if they can avoid it. That's the difference between Nvidia and AMD. Nvidia would take the financial hit to stay ahead in the benchmarks because winning is that important to them. However, I was told a couple of weeks ago that the A100 Titan was a non-starter and that instead the Titan would be based on GA102. And I was also told to ignore A100's performance and that GA102 performs highly in graphics. And it looks like Nvidia, when it comes to gaming, will at least bring their A game again. And sad to say it, but I was also informed by the same source that, in power efficiency terms at least, RDNA 2 isn't as big a deal as Nvidia once thought it would be. And while it looks like RDNA 2 will be a clear step ahead of Turing, Ampere looks like it's another large leap for Nvidia, least in performance per watt, which is the basis of it all. Performance per watt is the basis of ultimate performance. And just in case you're wondering how trustworthy this source is, they provided me with a shot of an engineering sample Ampere graphics card. And after running some checks on it, it checks out. I don't have any numbers on Ampere though, but obviously I've seen what the recent leaks suggest from guys like Tom at Moore's Law is Dead, and I won't be surprised if Nvidia is at least 50% faster than the 2080 Ti, and probably even faster. And that can lead us on to the summary. Technology is a constantly moving target, and a large part of winning is timing. In this video, you've seen how Nvidia has messed around and toiled with 7nm, yet will still probably come out of it as winners. And part of that reason is how long it has taken the Radeon Technologies group to simply get RDNA 2 out of the door. If you recall previous videos where I talked about the game consoles and some leaks there, the earliest leak we got was from APISAC back in January 2019. And AMD in fact actually had tested Gonzalo, which we reckoned was the PS5 platform, in October 2018. So that means they had 7nm RDNA 2 silicon back then, we think. And yet the first concrete information we started to get on Navi 2X on the desktop came in January 2020. That's a year later. Now, it's true that engineering samples are out in the wild for a long time, but it should also be clear that the console APUs do have priority over discrete graphics, which is something I said would happen months ago in a previous video. I realise that the consoles haven't launched yet either, however, that is almost certainly due to the lifespan of the console cycle. And AMD also, remember, waited on getting all those TSMC wafers after Apple finally moved off the 7nm node. This delay in the consoles, it's not really a delay, this has been planned timing all along, the 7-year console cycle. And remember, all last year we watched how the PlayStation 5 clock speeds increased first from 1800 MHz to 2 GHz and then finally 2.23 GHz. So they've clearly had working RDNA 2 parts for a long time, they just weren't desktop parts. And so Nvidia, after making a meal of 7nm, will not be punished in the way they should have been. At worst, they'll be a couple of months late, and a little bit faster again. For a while, I was honestly, firmly of the belief that AMD were going to win this generation, at least against anything other than a huge GA100 Titan. But the mere fact that, from what I've been told at least, Nvidia is going to create a Titan again on GA102 tells me that they must be very confident of winning. We know what Nvidia are like. They are winners and they hate losing. Nvidia don't even allow their X80 class of chip to lose to AMD. I mean, if they had to launch an Ampere Titan that lost to Big Navi, that would be an absolute disaster for their reputation. They would rather not launch that card at all. So for them to launch a Titan, a 3080 Ti and a 3080 that all lose to AMD's fastest card? I highly doubt it. I think that they are launching a Titan at all speaks volumes. They expect to win again and with a bit to spare. And this could just come down to that larger die size thing again, which I talked about at the top of the video. 505 square millimeters is a big chip, but is there any reason to believe that Nvidia hasn't got a 650 square millimeter gaming chip? It's certainly what they've been doing over the past few generations. Why would they not do it again? Even if RDNA 2 is massively more efficient, a lot faster, you're not going to beat a chip that is 30% larger. And this problem for AMD here is they're simply not taken seriously in the pro segments. This is where it all starts. But at some point along the line, they're going to have to actually fight these battles if they're going to win them. And regarding this whole thing, how Nvidia managed to determine that RDNA 2 maybe isn't quite as efficient as they first feared, Nvidia certainly now has access to the game consoles. They have been out there in the wild for some time, so they will know exactly how much power RDNA 2 requires for this level of performance. If the Series X and PlayStation 5 are pulling 250 watts of power during gaming, Nvidia already knows that RDNA 2 on the desktop will be a furnace. On the other hand though, they could still lose to ultimate performance, even if AMD pushes their top cards to unheard levels of power, just in order to win. AMD have launched 500 watt graphics cards in the past, including this 295X2. I mean, sure, this was a dual GPU, but it's still just one water-cooled card. And TSMC's 7nm appears to scale a long way with power. And in fact, on that topic, where we can see this 400 watts TDP of A100, I was told it was actually capable of drawing 750 watts. And so it's quite likely that if Nvidia needs to push themselves to previously unseen limits as well, with a 7nm TSMC Ampere gaming chip, they're going to be able to do that if they want. And while I think it's going to be close in the end, I do think Nvidia will just do enough to win again. The more interesting cards by far though will be the mid-range, and hopefully we might even get back to some decent prices and the resumption of competition. I for one would much rather pay say $400 for a 6800 XT which loses to Nvidia's mid-range, rather than pay $700 for a card that beats Nvidia's mid-range. And the difference is when Nvidia wins, they tend to drive AMD's prices down, which sadly is not the case the other way around. Catch you later, guys.